Morning, everybody. Welcome to the channel. My name is Dan, the Jazz Shepherd. My records are my sheep, and I am the shepherd. And we've been collecting quite a great jazz collection here. And we just recently completed another discography that I want to share with you. I have pretty much completed the LP section of this discography a couple years back. The 10 inches took me a little longer to find. And I finally found all, I think there's 24, if I remember. Some of them, I don't think there's any numbers omitted here, honestly. So let's just dive right in. And of course, we're talking about Teddy Reig's Roost label. We talked about Roost somewhat on that last episode and the importance of Teddy Reig and jazz and how he was a street hustler with some pull. He knew how to make money off drugs, off of women, off of clubs. He was a character, but he had respect on the streets. And like I said, he had some pull in music circles, and he also had access to the great black musicians via his vices and his dealings in the street community. He would hear quickly who was a great player, who was leading the charge up in Harlem, who was throwing it down in Brooklyn. And so he had his thumb on the pulse of a lot of the sounds that were happening in New York, and he used that to great utility at Savoy, and probably even more so when he starts Roost. And I mean, he's a fascinating character. He's one of the most interesting people. My eyes are watering. One of the most interesting people in jazz circles in some ways is Teddy Reig, and his reputation was one of, you know, a fierce competitor, but he also was known to have his guys back when needed. You know, he certainly doesn't seem to have the vitriol that's shared towards Herman Lubinsky or the Chess Brothers. But all the same, there's a lot of stories about Teddy Reig. And, I mean, just the man in his imposing size. He was no small man by any measure. But, so he comes to Roost. And by comes to, I mean he starts it. And he's already learned a lot of the tricks of the industry working for Savoy and Herman Lubinsky up in Newark, down in Newark, I guess. But he's got his own connections. He's tired of working with Lubinsky. He wants to really glean the streets of New York and harvest the best talent he can find on his own and make that his own enterprise. He named it after the club, the Royal Roost. And you'll see the term Royal Roost and you'll see the term Roost, and yes, it's the same label. And again, Roulette did buy that Roost out eventually and reissued a lot of it, somewhat changing some of how it looked. But let's just dive right in. And these first 5 I'm about to show you took me the longest time to collect. In fact, I just got 2 of these 3 quite recently. And this is before the era of Burt Goldblatt. This is for the era of the LP artwork. We're talking 50-51. And this is some fantastic Bud Powell. And it's got Bud Powell with Max Roach and Curly Russell. So a pretty fantastic trio, to say the least. Powell's still at the pinnacle of his abilities here. And he's one of the guys, along with Parker and Dizzy, that really brings bebop to the world and reshapes the piano in the image of bebop. You know, and he's just a dynamic player. And so this is number 401 in the 400 series, which is the Roost 10-inch series. And there's 2 Bud Powell Roost 10 inches that do get coupled onto a Roost 12-inch. So, I mean, that's partly why I didn't grab these right away, because I had the music already. But this is, I mean, the real facsimile. And just a really cool piece, and one that I finally found for a decent price. Here's number 2, 402, the Stan Getz Quartet. And Royal Roost, 1619 Broadway, New York. So you're talking on the northern edges of downtown Manhattan. Do not list the musicians on this one. The back of most of these is just blank, sadly. Sometimes the record will have the musicians, this one doesn't seem to. I haven't got around to looking it up on Discogs to find out who the players are on this. It could be some of that Jimmy Rainey stuff he did, but it also could be a whole nother set of musicians. I'm not even sure. I've listened to it a couple times. But again, you got some pretty serious talent here already with Stan Getz and Bud Powell. And then 403 is Georgie Auld, who's a Torontonian, a great player. I love his music at Brunswick and Chorale. Just a real ethereal player. Again, he's not African American, so he doesn't have that stress and that release. He's more of a storyteller, narrates a sweet kind of romantic evening at home. But the guy could play. And if I remember, he might have played with Goodman for a while. He played with one of the big swing bands for a while. But then he's quite successful on his own in the early to mid-50s, into the late 50s at Emercy even. And he has really fallen into obscurity. But in the 50s, he was a guy that you would see show up in some of in the polls, Playboy, Downbeat, etc. He was a well-known player that sold really well, and again, he's really become a forgotten player almost in totality. Sadly, this is Volume 2, Stan Getz, with his Swedish All-Stars, featuring Bengt Hallberg on the piano, and you have a little mix of people here with Gunnar Johnson, Jack Noren, Kenneth Fagerlund. Lars Gulen's on some of this, the great baritone player. So number 404 is another Stan Getz release. And most of the Stan Getz stuff does get reissued on the 12-inch LP. I'm not sure if all of it does, because there's actually quite a bit here of that. Here's James Moody, which is the last one I collected. Just got this one in the mail yesterday, with Roger Garrett on the trumpet, Raymond Full on the piano, Pierre Michelot on the bass, and Pierre Lamarchand on the drums. Obviously, this was recorded in Paris. Moody was a great player. Had some success in the 40s. And then I do believe he spent a number of years in Europe, escaping, the American condition. And if you're a black man, you know all about what the American condition means. It was just interesting for these guys. Interesting is probably not the right word, but to go to Paris or to be in London or Copenhagen and to be treated with such respect and to be seen as almost royalty. It had to be conflicting for a lot of these guys, and I'm sure a lot of them had a tough time coming home to America to face, the segregation and the awful conditions. And yet, at the same token, when you stayed in Europe, you left your roots and you left your black community behind. And a lot of them speak about how they missed what was happening in the black neighborhoods and what was the cool, hip new language and what was happening in the music scene. You did become very disconnected when you stayed in Paris or Copenhagen for 6 months to a year to 2 years to 5 years to even longer for some of these guys, because there wasn't the internet, there wasn't telephones, there wasn't a ton of easy ways to keep up with what was happening in the chocolate cities back in America, as George Clinton once called them. And so I do remember reading a lot of them coming and saying, they came home in spite of all the ick because they wanted to reconnect with black neighborhoods and black American communities and just reestablish themselves. They often became quite forgotten players in Europe. Guys like Don Byas, who went over there fairly well regarded, and by the time he came back, he was fairly forgotten. So they paid a price for that freedom, for that liberty, and often it translated into obscurity. And so collecting these first 5 Roosts is a pretty big deal for me. Pretty thrilled about it. And like I said, it completes the sequence, and let's just dive into the rest of it. 406 is Jazz at Storyville, the great Billy Taylor. So that must have been recorded in Boston at the Storyville Club, owned by George Wein. And yeah, it says George Wein Presents, which is interesting because Storyville Records must have started somewhere around this time. And what a lineup here. You have Billy Taylor on the piano, one of the great pianists who we just talked about recently. The great Charlie Mingus is on bass here. So he's still very much a sideman, playing in the Tal Farlow trio and kind of somewhat unknown. He played on the West Coast for a while. And then Marquise Foster's on the drums, a nice pencil drawing. I think this is a Bert Goldblatt, if I'm not positive. It might be, it might not be. Those penciled lines sure looks like a Goldblatt to me. His name is usually on there somewhere if he did it, but I mean, I'm not seeing his name, but that everything about that says Burt Goldblatt to me. And again, this is the beginning, 52 probably here, 53 maybe, of LP art and that fantastic jazz design that we think of. Roost is one of the companies, along with Bethlehem, and a few others. Storyville had some great art. Again, Goldblatt's kind of responsible for a lot of that. That really changed how music was packaged. You know what I mean? And it's an important development in the music scene. The cover art, how that presents and helps sell the music. And jazz was at the forefront of that. And these are the labels that you can see are helping make that transition. Number 407 is Stan Getz Quintet. Another great cover. I'm pretty sure that's a Goldblatt as well. Burt Goldblatt right there. And this has Al Haig, Jimmy Rainey, Teddy Kotick, and Tiny Khan on the drums. So fantastic players all around. Great album cover. This is Getz kind of at his pinnacle of bebop into modern. Just a fantastic player, but he was also well medicated by this point. Stan Getz, pretty notorious heroin addict. 408 is the great Kai Winding. Speaking of Denmark, one of the great Danish imports in jazz. Kai was a fantastic player who, of course, played with J.J. Johnson for a long time, as I'm sure most of you know. J.J. Johnson and him make some recordings at Savoy and at Bethlehem, and then they get signed to Columbia Records, where they make a long string of recordings. But the funny thing is those recordings, even though there's like a dozen of them at least, all happen in a couple years span. So the Kai Winding, J.J. Johnson collaboration isn't long for the world, but they do a lot in that short time. And then when Impulse gets launched in the fall of 61, fall 60 into the spring of 61, they convinced them to reunite and to make another recording there for Impulse, one or two albums actually, and but that was kind of a reunification of these two great trombonists. So I mean, when you kind of come to it early, you see so much of their work everywhere. Those Columbia records are fairly omnipresent in most record stores. You see the Bethlehem, you see the Savoy, you see some of the Impulse stuff. It feels like they must have played together for 20 years, and it was actually far from that. But again, you have arrangements by Jerry Mulligan, the great baritone player, who by this time was establishing himself as one of the preeminent arrangers in jazz. And the black community was even taking notice of what Jerry Mulligan was doing. This is on the heels of the great Birth of the Cool, where he was a founding, fundamental part of, and didn't receive the due credit he was needed. Of course, Miles ended up taking much of that credit. Whether or not this is a Burt Goldblatt, it sure looks like it is. Again, I'm not seeing his name, but that pencil line, that's so his style. It's got to be him. And then you have Mulligan on the baritone, Brew Moore on the tenor, who does some great stuff on the West Coast, often at Fantasy. Max Roach is on the drums, the unassailable Max Roach out of Chicago. George Wallington, the Italian-born New Yorker, who was the king of fashion and styles on the piano, who has some great recordings at this time at Prestige and at Progressive. And I mean, Wallington's a pretty big figure in the mid-50s, and then Carly Russell on the bass again. So again, you just have this incredible cachet of talent, and you're seeing races being mixed here on these recordings. And this is number 409, a Roost Records tailor-made piano featuring the Billy Taylor Trio. And it's a fantastic Burt Goldblatt cover. I mean, the graphic design is just so striking and somewhat timeless, I think. I mean, some of that color patterning is a little dated to the decades it's from, but I think it still looks so fresh and vivid, and I think it's a pleasure to look at. I really enjoy that cover, and I enjoy that style of aesthetic a lot. Again, it reminds me of things in my grandma's home, like the piano teaching books would have these type of borrowed from jazz designs. And so it's kind of cool to get to the source of a lot of that graphic design school. where jazz was really driving that. The Royal Roost always has that wonderful blue navy label. And so it always says Roost Records on the jacket itself, but they often just say Royal Roost on the label. So I mean, you can see how it's the same label. So jumping to 410 now is the great Johnny Smith, who we talked about the other day as one of the great guitar players. I remember Alabama born. He didn't stay in the jazz scene super long. Here he's playing with the great Stan Getz again, and Eddie Safransky, Don Lemon, and Sanford Gold. So this is actually one of the 10 inches that was on that Moonlight in Vermont, Johnny Smith, featuring Stan Getz record. So this is one of them. Again, a great Burt Goldblatt cover showing them doing their thing. Pink. It seems like pink was kind of a hot color in graphic design at that time. I'm not sure if it was something that wasn't in use very consistently, but this is a Stan Getz led session now. Burt Goldblatt cover once again. Tiny Khan drums, Teddy Kotick on the bass, Jimmy Rainey on the guitar, Al Haig on the piano. So it's a great little quintet that he has working for a number, maybe a year or so, I think it is. Probably 51, 52. Again, Rainey's a great guitarist. We talked about him the other day. Boom. There's the shadow. It's just wonderful, you know. The shadow of Jimmy Rainey playing the guitar with Stan Getz and the color cutouts. It's all just wonderfully, beautifully designed by Goldblatt. One of Goldblatt's probably most famous covers, and one that I think sets the table for Reed Miles' design at Blue Note, is this Bud Powell record, Fort Roost number 412. It's just got the two-color split palette with a nice pencil line drawing of Bud Powell playing, and there it is. And you can see this kind of simple design, the simple font, the sans serif designed font, readable, legible, memorable, striking colors. I mean, a lot of that is what you're going to see at Blue Note coming up in the late 50s into the 60s. And here again, Burt Goldblatt's really setting the table. And David Stone Martin is one of the other preeminent guys kind of leading album jacket design at this time. But of course, his drawings are much more ethereal and sweeping lines and impressionistic, where Goldblatt's much more realistic in most of what he's doing. And most of the color on David Stone Martin's stuff feels like watercolors, you know, and soft blurs of it, and a little yellow here, and the colors don't necessarily line up with the drawings. You know, I mean, it's ethereal and feeling and swooping and swirling and ghost-like vespers. A lot of David Stone Martin's work. Goldblatt's work is much more modern, colors in blocks, not just in like weird swoops and sweeps. I mean, I have some examples of what I'm talking about with him right here even. This is classic David Stone Martin. And see how the orange and the yellow, there's no lines to it. It's not in any specific, it's just kind of sweeping and thought-provoking. You know, it's not the same as what Goldblatt's presenting. And Goldblatt, I feel, is really the progenitor of a lot of modern jazz design going into the late 50s and 60s. He's really an impactful, important figure. And again, Powell was at the height of his ability here. A real mover and shaker, and dear friends with Thelonious Monk, fellow New York pianist. And if you followed this channel for any length of time, you know how many great piano players were coming out of New York. I don't know if it was the grit of Manhattan that just seemed to make sense to those 88 keys, but man, the talent on the piano that comes out of New York is really an interesting aspect of the New York scene. And I think part of it was surviving in New York was tough. It's an expensive city then, as it is now. And as a horn player, you can't really book a gig on your own. As a piano player, a lot of pianists can get booked to play solo. And you can probably make a living easier behind a piano than you can behind most of the other instruments that exist in jazz. Maybe a singer, but all the same, it's an incredible densely populated piano scene in New York. Number 413 is, again, Johnny Smith, who's actually what we're listening to in the background here. A nice pencil line drawing of Johnny. Nice big S. Tell me you can't see the Reed Miles Blue Note aesthetic here and what he's doing with the big letters, the cut angles. I mean, it screams a lot of what the Blue Note design team looked like 5, 7, 10 years later. A cover I love, and it's a bit of a deviation from Goldblatt's normal work, but it's still super cool, is Dizzy Gillespie Over Paris. And I think this was licensed from Vogue, perhaps, a French label. I'm not positive on that, but you got the Parisian streets underneath him there. And then he's kind of just floating over the top, again in pink. Fantastic design, 414. So I mean, you're seeing some pretty big names in jazz here at Roost. And this is ahead of Blue Note. Blue Note at this time is fairly, I mean, it's obscure at 56, 57, but Blue Note at 52, 53 is very obscure. And they're really licensing obscure artists from Europe, you know, compilations from the West Coast. They have not defined the Blue Note scene at all by this point. Prestige is kind of getting into a swing, and they're ahead of Blue Note as well. Riverside is just doing the bare beginnings of covering the New Orleans revival scene. They haven't really dabbled in modern jazz, and they won't until 55 or 56 when Monk comes to Riverside. And so you really see Roost being a leader of the pack here. And they're almost a sister to what's happening at Bethlehem and Storyville in terms of time frame and innovation, graphic design. And if anything, Roost would have been the blacker counterpart to what Storyville in Boston and Bethlehem in New York were providing for the white jazz cats. A hip environment with the modernist players that was really willing to be cutting edge and take some challenges and risks. I mean, that was some of the leading stuff happening in jazz at that point. Sonny Stitt, the Lone Wolf, shows up here, number 415, playing arrangements from the pen of Johnny Richards, who was a pretty famous arranger at this point. A cool, again, line drawing, exclamation point. It's one of those ones where you're not sure how you want to orient it, but the opening is right there, so I orient it like that. I mean, I love the design, I love the cover. And again, you see some echoes of what Reed Miles is going to come to do soon down the road here. I'm just going to flip this. Number 416, another great cover is the Lee Konitz, originally Konitz. You can see how they do original Lee Konitz. Cool graphics, the orange, you know, slice of a peeled orange almost, you know, with the cool drawing of the young Lee Konitz in the background, seated at a chair playing his alto. Josh by Gosh. And I think we're getting to the point where there's stuff on the back there is. And there's no mention of who the band is. But again, a wonderful record. Konitz was a light player who had a wonderful tone. It could be a little stringent at times, but it also adds a kind of a desperation and urgency to his playing. Konitz, I mean, for a mellow kind of cat, he seems to have a bit of an urgency and desperation in his tone and how he presents at times, which is interesting because a lot of white cats don't really reveal that in their playing, but he definitely has some turmoil. You can feel it. I find this one of the stranger covers by Burt Goldblatt here. It's chamber music by the Stan Getz Quintet, and that chamber music element is kind of why we're going to get the graphic look here that we're getting. But they've got Getz here in old colonial attire. Rainey's looking almost medieval with his powdered wig. The graphics look like something from a piano book teaching Christmas songs. But it's, again, chamber music, so you're going to get, I'm guessing, a string quartet playing with the group. And I have not heard this in a while. And maybe Delancey Music Shop, 140 Delancey Street. cool. Little provenance right there. If I remember, there's some, the chamber music element is some orchestral stuff behind this one. Again, it's been a while since I put this one on. It's a weird cover. It's got a Christmas theme. Like if you open this up and it was learn how to play Jingle Bells, you wouldn't be that shocked by that. But it's fine Stan Getz. Number 418, the second Sonny Stitt release here at Roost. A fantastic cover. Again, he's playing at the Hi-Hat, a club in Manhattan, if I remember. I think it's just great graphic work there. And again, it's something that Reed Miles would definitely be comfortable doing for Jackie McLean 10 years later on. All the hi-hat, the top hats. Just a cool piece. Wonderful graphic. He's playing here with Dean Earl on the piano, Bernie Griggs on the bass, and I got Marquise Foster again on the drums. Fantastic piece. And you really feel the young Sonny Stitt and all of his fire. You know what I mean? He's a real fiery player at times in his career. Number 419 is Piano Mambo with Eddie Bonamere. And Bonamere is kind of a forgotten player, an African-American cat from Harlem, who, oddly enough, part of his legacy at this point is being known for having mixed Catholic themes with some jazz playing. And he actually ends up writing some spiritual music that got used in the churches, and he would perform often for special events in churches. A very spiritual cat, without question. He has a few more 12-inch records at Roost in the later 50s, but this is a really cool piece to find. You have Lenox Avenue and 140th Street, which is obviously a Harlem address, Savoy Ballroom. Just a fantastic, cool piece. A great gold-black cover. I mean, it's just a nostalgic-looking, wonderful piece of jazz history right there. Number 420, another Stan Getz Quintet, Jazz at Storyville Volume 3. Again with Haig, Rainey, Kodak, and Tiny Khan. Robert Nex, Signal, Hershey Bear, and Move. Young Stan Getz. Again, there's a photograph on this one. Guess that's still a Burt Goldblatt. So, I mean, even the fonts, the color choices, he's really a leader in so many ways. And Reed is just bringing in this talent. You know what I mean? He's just harvesting the best of the best. And when you're a street hustler, you have your ear to the street. You know what people are bubbling about, what's happening under the surface, what's new to the scene. And he's really, like I said, at the forefront of modern jazz, post-bebop. And he was the one who helped document bebop at Savoy. You know, I mean, you really have to tip your hat to what he was accomplishing here at Roost. This is Johnny Smith in a mellow mood. Another beautiful cover. And this is Goldblatt that you see a lot at Bethlehem with the single tone photograph. You see this obviously at Blue Note and Prestige and Riverside as well. Those photographs with the one kind of monochromatic color with some simple font. That's a little bit more serif than you would see at Blue Note. But again, a beautiful cover by a beautiful player. 421 is a second copy of that. Neither of them are in great shape. This is goodies from Eddie Davis, 422. And Eddie Davis, of course, was the great Eddie Lockjaw Davis. This is fairly early in his career. He's probably just about, maybe he's already started to play with Basie at this point. But he's just one of the fantastic, most intense rhythm and blues, gospel blues players that jazz ever saw. And from my understanding, he never was a guy who read music or could read charts, but he could play with the best of them. And listening to him battle with Johnny Griffin on some of those great records they did together, you really hear Griffin's virtuosity and dexterity, and then the blues and swing and flirtatious nature of Eddie Lockjaw Davis. This is a record that can go for decent money. And I remember finding this in the wild for $20 and being like, yeah, cool find. Number 423 is Split Kick featuring Stan Getz. Again, tell me you don't see the Blue Note graphic design in that. Pretty clearly, this is a cutting-edge graphic piece of work. And I think it's probably the same quintet as well on this one. Just lists other Roost releases here. But number 423, Split Kick. It's featuring Stan Getz. And then last but not least, what we've been listening to is the Sentimental Mood of Johnny Smith, number 424. And he's just got his hand over his face. And it's just, again, a beautiful album cover by one of the great artists of that time. And then they move into what becomes the 2200 series LP. And this first one that's issued as a 1200 number. And it's like, I think it's Eddie Davis. I think it's Eddie Davis and Sonny Stitt together, if I remember. And there's one release under that number, 1200. And then they move it on to the 2200 number. And I don't know if it's because Atlantic and Pacific and other labels were doing that 1200 sequence, but they decided to move on to the 2200 sequence instead. And there's about 50 titles in that are really outstanding work. A lot of great Sonny Stitt. A lot of great Johnny Smith. We talked about those Johnny Smith records the other day. So that's the Roost 10-inch sequence. Proud to say I've completed it. It's right up there with Bethlehem and Storyville as some of the most innovative, creative, and beautiful jazz of the early 50s. And the beauty extends to the artwork for Bethlehem, Storyville, and for Roost. The covers are just as gorgeous as the music that it contains. And they really kind of set the table for a lot of what's to come in jazz in the ensuing decade. So I hope you all enjoyed that. I'm proud of that completion. I do want to show this one to you. Dial Records was on a little label in the 40s. And they did some very important recordings with Charlie Parker. Some with Dizzy Gillespie, some with Fats Navarro. I think Miles Davis is on some of those sessions. And most of it gets issued on 78 RPM. And then I actually got this box set from the Dial Records. That's the complete Charlie Parker works. I think it's 4 or 5 records. Let me grab it. So this is the complete Parker on Dial. How many records is it? Let's find out. I think it's 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Come on. Maybe it's 6. 6 records. And so it's a pretty good testament and documentation of Parker's time at Dial in 47. Maybe a little bit in 46, a little bit in 48. And Dial wasn't really a jazz label. They just delved into it briefly for a few years. They were more of a classical label. And they weren't long for the jazz world either. They kind of depart the jazz world not long after they dove into it. And so Dial's not really... their legacy often revolves around their fantastic recordings of Parker and Gillespie and stuff. But Dial definitely wasn't something you look up their discography and go, what a great jazz canon. But this 10-inch here is some Dizzy Gillespie, the modern trumpets of Fats Navarro, Miles Davis, and Howard McGee. Couldn't pass it up when I found this the other day. I don't think most of this is on that box. That's that box that's more Parker-oriented. And so this probably does, some of this probably is on there because great sides of mine, 212. No, I'm guessing it's not. But it's probably only 4 songs. No, it's 4 on each side. Lucky Thompson, Dizzy Gillespie, Milt Jackson, Al Haig, Ray Brown, and Stan Levy. That's amazing. And then side 2 has Fats Navarro Move, Dizzy Gillespie Confirmation, Howard McGee, Thermodynamics, and Miles Davis Superman. And then side 1 has those 4 tracks by that Dizzy Gillespie Jasmine, that sextet. So a cool piece, a 10-inch find on Dial. And again, I'm not an expert at Dial by any means at this point. I know the Parker stuff fairly well. I just found this. I know there's a number of other cool Dial 10-inches that reissued the 78 RPM era stuff. But a cool piece nonetheless. And I've found a lot of Dizzy stuff lately. on all these little labels, you know, the Disney stuff at Discovery, the Disney stuff at DG, the Disney stuff at Esoteric, the Disney stuff at Roost. He does a lot of 10-inch work. GNP, he does some stuff in the early 50s. So he's showing up in multiple places, never anywhere too long. And I think all that, like I said before, kind of hurts his legacy because he's not at Prestige or Blue Note laying down on those collectible labels. He's more on these labels that are kind of under the surface and forgotten. And of course, Norman Granz is also recording Disney a lot in the 50s and into the 60s. So that wraps up today's episode. Hope you all enjoyed that. Cafe's been going great. We've been introducing a lot of people to jazz music and starting to sprinkle in some other elements into the soundscape as well, just to kind of bring people in and entrance them. It's been a wonderful, wonderful 2 weeks so far. Day number 14 is today. We're going to open the doors up here in a little bit. I probably won't get to publish this till maybe tonight. But I appreciate you all. Thank you for paying attention and being part of this channel and supporting me to get here. It's been a long year for me. Change is hard when you're 50 years old. And all that new stuff I had to go through, all the hoops I had to jump through, all the risk and the uncertainty and waiting for that big obstruction to come along that's going to block our progress. None of that happened really, thankfully. We kind of got through most of it pretty unscathed. So the cosmos has had our back. And so thank you all for your support and your love. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Hit that like button. It helps people find the episodes. Tell your friends about this channel if you're a jazz lover. I think we share something here that's unique. You know what I mean? We're not talking about the pressings and the audiophile side of things, which is fine. We're talking about the music and the history and the labels and the story behind the music and the story behind the people who helped make the music, like Teddy Reed. It's an interesting story that I've spent a lot of time digging into and researching, and I enjoy sharing it with you all. And we're never going to be viral sensations. You know what I mean? This is never going to take the world by storm. I mean, we're never going to have 1 million views. But I'd rather have a great community of people like-minded, understanding and loving this music and this philosophy. And that builds a sense of communion and community that I value. And so the comments and the feedback and the likes, it's all of high value to me and means the world to me. And I hope all of y'all get the chance to come visit the cafe someday and we can sit and mash it up, pull some records off the shelf and talk about this great music, this great history, this great story. The story of America, the story of us. Y'all be safe, stay blessed. I know that I am. Love you all. Talk to you soon. Peace. I also want a real quick mention. We have some new merchandise here. These are nice hoodies with the nice strings. Jazz Shepherd Coffee. It's got the cool logos on the sleeve. I can ship these to somebody if you want them. If you want to pay me through PayPal. I have hoodies and t-shirts, black and white options. And the hoodies go for $40 plus shipping. And the t-shirts go for $20 plus shipping, or $25. So if you guys want a hoodie or a t-shirt, message me. I'll be happy to take care of that for you, and I'll ship it to you as soon as we can. Appreciate you all. Take care. Peace.